Hi, welcome back to the McCall's Quilting Summer Garden Quilt-Along. I'm Laura Roberts and I'm your hostess for this lovely trip through the garden. And today we're going to finish up that first block, the corner block. So this is what the first block looks like when it's all put together. This is the one that's in the upper left corner of the quilt. In other words, these are the fabrics in that first upper left corner block. There are 4 corner blocks, but they have different fabric arrangements, but they all look like this. And if you'll remember, last time I made this section here. I made that corner unit, these 4 corner units. Well, in order to finish the block, we have to make the side units. These guys right here. And remember I showed you how to do an hourglass in a quick way back a couple segments ago. I am going to show you how to go ahead and make that hourglass the old-fashioned way. And I'm also going to show you how to make flying geese the old-fashioned way, so you can do it either way. So why don't we go ahead and get started. I'm just going to move our block over. Okay, so here we go. Now, these are hourglasses that I made in the same manner that I showed you. But if you're making them the way you might usually do it, you're going to be cutting triangles. So you're going to have a 5 1/4 inch square in your cutting instructions, and you're going to cut it diagonally twice, and you end up with triangles like this. Okay, it's pretty simple to sew triangles together, but you have to make sure you're sewing them together the right way. And that's going to be, so it mimics this, all right? So I can do it that way, that's fine. But what you don't want to do, you don't want to do that, okay? So just make sure you have them lined up like this, okay? And then I'm just going to flop that over, and you can see there a stitching line, and that's how you're going to stitch. Now here's something to remember. This is a bias edge. All right, bias edges have a lot more wiggle room, they have more play, they're really flexible, which is great when you're doing something like bias binding and you want to go around a curve. But when you're wanting it to stay straight, you just have to handle it a little more carefully. So one of the things you can do is use spray starch before you start cutting. That kind of locks them in place and makes them less likely to shift. And just the other thing is just keep it in the back of your mind that you want to handle it really carefully. Okay, so I'm going to throw a pin in here. I'll turn it around that way, because when I start sewing, I'm going to start with the corner going into the machine first. And the reason for that is if I start sewing that seam like this, I'm starting with a point. Obviously, we have to do that sometimes, but it can be tricky when you're starting with a point not to have it go down into the guts of the machine. So I'm going to start sewing that way. Okay, so let me show you how this looks. All right, glasses on, there we go. Okay, so I have that pin in there, and I'm just going to sew along. Again, remember I have a 1/4 inch foot there? Well, this 1/4 inch foot also has a line over on the other side. And you can do the same thing I'm doing, starting at the corner. If you have a 1/4 inch foot that doesn't show that 1/4 inch on both sides, you'll have to start with that little point, okay? Now here we go. There we go. I'm just going to stitch along like that. And I've got an awl that I'm just going to use to get those little points to line up. Because of the bias, there's a lot of play in the fabrics when they're going under the needle, just like that. You can see why I prefer the other method. There we go. All right, that one's all done. Alrighty, get that out of the way, get the pin out, and here it is. So it looks just like the units I made the other way. And I showed you in a previous segment how to sew the two together. So I won't waste time showing you that now. But if you want to do it that way, obviously you can, okay? And then another thing I want to show you, I showed you how to make no-waste flying geese. But you need to know how to make them the old-fashioned way if you want to make them that way. So let me run you through that. Okay, on your little squares, you're going to go ahead and draw a diagonal line. And you remember how to do this. Whoops, turn you over. Okay, you're just going to put your ruler from point to corner like that. And do it again on this guy. For a flying goose made this way, you need one rectangle and two squares. Okay, this is super simple. I'm going to put it on my rectangle like that. Don't put it on your rectangle like that and put this one like that, because when you sew and flip, you're going to have a totally different thing. You're not going to have a flying goose. So you can put them like this, or like this and like this. Just don't put them so they're parallel. Okay, so there we go. Now in this case, you're going to sew right on the line. You're not going to be sewing to either side like you've done before. When you sew them, the either side thing is when you're going to cut down the middle and make two of something, which we're not doing. This is for stitching and flipping. When you stitch and flip, you're going to sew on the line. Okay, well, I'm not going to bother with pins this time because I don't really think I need them. It adheres pretty nicely to itself, the fabric does. Again, I am not starting with the corner because I don't want that corner to disappear down into the guts of the machine. All right? Okay. Now, do you see what's happening here? It's coming off. So I better get a pin in there, huh? Because that's not going to turn out right. And that's another thing to know. Every machine is different. So if you start trying something and you see that it shifts like that, you may want to put a pin in it or see if it'll just go back like that. Well, that went back pretty nicely, but I'm just going to take out some stitches so that it doesn't have any little bumps or squiggles in it. And I'm really glad things like this happen when I'm filming. I know that seems kind of counterintuitive, but the only way I can help you know what to not do or how to fix something that goes wrong is if I do it here. Okay, there we go. Now, do this again. And this time, I'll put a pin in it. There we go. Okie doke. Again, this time I'm going to start again on the side. I don't want to sew starting in that corner if I can avoid it. Okay, and I'm just going to go right on the line, just like that. All right. Whoops. There we go. Snip off my threads. Okay, and now you can cut either with scissors, or if you want to use a rotary cutter, you can. But all I'm doing is cutting away the seam allowance. But I'm going to teach you a trick. Instead of going ahead and just cutting them off, cut only the top one. So I'm going to trim that one away like that. But the bottom is still there intact, and I'll show you why. Get these things out of my way. Okay. Because I cut away just the top one, I can now press this over and make sure I'm aligning it with the rectangle underneath, which means that my finished goose will be exactly 2.5 by 4.5 inches. So when I press it, I'm going to press over. Now see, here's something you could do by mistake if you were pressing without something to align with. I could do that where I don't really get it up and over onto this edge. So instead, because I can line it up with that, I can make sure it's pressed exactly the way it should be and is exactly the right size. See that? How it just aligns perfectly? And then, once I know I've got it in the right place, then I'm going to come back, oops, and trim off the cream. Some people would actually leave the cream in the quilt. I don't like the bulk, but you could. So, to finish the flying goose, I would just do the same thing. I would sew this one, do the same trim and flip and press, and you'd have a goose. All right, so let's get these guys out of the way. All little extra dudes. Okay. So to make that little side unit, you need your hourglasses, and you need your goose, and you need a 2.5 by 4.5 inch cream rectangle. Okay? Now you're going to want to look at the pictures of the block to make sure you have this aligned right. These guys go like that. The little white triangles are up and down. It's not like that. It's like this. And a good way to remember that is that when you add these to the bottom, what have I got right there? I have a square, okay? So that's a way to remember what orientation you want. And so I'm just gonna sew one of these units together for you. And the way I'm doing it, I'm just going to, I have that in the right place. I'm just gonna flip that up like that. And I'm gonna pin this in place, making sure I've got those seams aligned. You can feel them, like that. And then I'll do the same thing here, making sure that's aligned. And throw a pin in there. That sounds funny, doesn't it? Throw a pin. I wouldn't want to try that. I have done enough damage to myself with the rotary cutter. I don't need to start throwing pins around. Okay, where's my little thread guy? Oops, there we go. Okay, so again, just my regular 1/4 inch seam here. Get that right under the foot. Get that pin out of there before I run over it. You know, it's not just that it's could hurt the pin or that it can break a needle. It's that it can hurt you. If you get a pin that breaks and in just the right way, the needle will also break. You can have, and then the pin or the needle that can actually fly. So you really want to try to get in the habit of removing the pins. If you're like me, you will forget sometimes. And thus far, I've been safe. But I think now that I'm wearing glasses when I'm actually at the machine, probably makes things a little safer. Okay, so that's sewn on like that. And I'm going to go ahead and press it. Okay, now this is one where I would press it open because you've got bulk already in place on both sides. Okay, there we go. See, you've got that seam allowance and that seam allowance. So if you press it open, then no one seam allowance is getting all of that. Because if you look, when you get into this area here, let me show you. I want you to see this. You have a little seam allowance under here where that remains of that little triangle is. You have 2 layers just under the triangle. And then you have that layer and that layer. So you have 4 layers. If you put this guy over there too, you've got 6 layers in one spot. And that, you know, I know it doesn't really matter a whole lot, and a lot of people would never see it, but it bothers me. So that's why I press open sometimes. Okay, so now all I have to do is add that rectangle to the top. It's the same thing, except I'm not having to worry about any points to match. And let me show you. See how nicely those went together? Isn't that pretty? It's so cool when things work out the way you want them to. All right, pin that guy. Alrighty. Oh, it's just a plain old 1/4 inch seam. There we go. I'm going to make sure that these guys stay aligned. You know, sometimes when you're sewing, take a look, make sure, you know, sometimes if you can just see that top piece, make sure you can move that over so you can see the tiniest thread underneath so you know that they're staying aligned when you're sewing. Oop, move that pin out. Alrighty, there we go. Oh, I sewed over a pin. See? I told you I'd do it. Ah! Oh well. Fortunately, I survived. And now I'm just going to press that rectangle open, like that. I'm pressing seam allowance actually under the lighter fabric this time because there's nothing else over here. It's the only seam allowance, and it'll keep it nice and flat. Okay? And that's all there is to it. It's an easy unit to make. And you'll see you'll be making 4 of them per block, just like you made 4 corner units per block. And the way it goes together, you're going to sew 3 rows. The first row and the third row, or top and bottom rows, have those 2 of your corner units and the one we just made, one side unit here. Okay? It's the same on the bottom, exactly the same, it's just that when you're positioning it, it goes the other way. The center row, which is this narrow one here, has the 4.5-inch square that you cut and 2 of these units. Again, just sewn like that. So you do 1 row, 2 row, 3 row, you sew your rows together, and there's your block. So go ahead and make your 4 corner blocks, and when I get back to you next time, you'll have those done and you'll be ready to move on to the edge blocks. So if you want to have the same fabric to play with that I'm playing with, which is absolutely luscious, and I really do wish you could feel it through the camera, you'll want to go to mccallsquilting.com/quiltalong, because our kit has these Northcott fabrics in it, the Charlotte collection and also Toscana solids, which we'll be working with next time. So do your homework, get your corner blocks done, and I hope you have a great time. I'll see you back here next time.